Welcome to the Neurocrush Immersion. Today we discuss of Advaita and Zen, journeys of transformation. Every meaningful journey begins with a question. Not always a question we consciously ask ourselves, but one that quietly takes root in the mind and refuses to leave. This episode began the same way. A few weeks ago, I found myself reading an elegant paper by Professor N. Siddharthan, comparing two of Asia's great contemplative traditions, Advaita Vedanta, articulated most powerfully by Adi Shankaracharya, and Zen Buddhism, whose early spirit is so vividly captured in the life of Bodhidharma. At first glance, it seemed a familiar philosophical exercise. Two traditions, two understandings of non-duality, their similarities, their differences, and the distinct ways in which each imagined the path to liberation. Professor Siddharthan's paper is both scholarly and thoughtful. He points out that despite emerging from different religious worlds, both Advaita and Zen share a striking intuition. Both invite us to see beyond the ordinary divisions that structure human experience: self and world, subject and object, observer and observed. Even the word non-dual, he reminds us, is deliberately negative. To describe ultimate reality simply as one would still imply the possibility of two. Both traditions speak by removing distinctions rather than adding new ones. Yet, as I continued reading, something else began to intrigue me. The paper explored where Advaita and Zen eventually diverged. Shankara's Advaita sought the underlying unity beneath the diversity of existence, while Zen insisted that reality was to be encountered directly. These differences shaped very different ideals of human life: the liberated Jivan Mukta in Advaita and the compassionate Bodhisattva in Mahayana Buddhism. It was an elegant comparison, but another question quietly emerged. It had nothing to do with metaphysics, it had everything to do with two remarkable human beings. Shankara was born in the lush landscapes of southern India, and while still a young monk, walked across an entire subcontinent. He debated scholars, visited temples, encountered rival philosophies, and eventually established institutions that continue to shape Indian spiritual life more than a millennium later. We have a whole podcast episode on Shankara if that interests you, and I'd explore that with you in the future. Bodhidharma, if tradition is to be believed, also began his journey in southern India. Yet, instead of traveling across India, he crossed mountains and seas into China, entering a civilization whose language and culture were profoundly different from his own. There, he planted the seeds of what would later become Chan and eventually Zen. Two young seekers, two extraordinary journeys, two philosophies that would transform millions of lives. And then the question became impossible to ignore. What if the journeys themselves mattered? Not simply because they carried ideas from one place to another, but because they transformed the travelers. Modern neuroscience tells us that prolonged encounters with novelty, uncertainty, and unfamiliar worlds reshape the way the brain learns, adapts, and perceives reality. Historians remind us that great ideas rarely emerge in isolation. They mature through dialogue, disagreement, observation, and lived experience. Could it be that before Advaita and Zen became philosophies, they were journeys? I do not know the answer, nor is this episode an attempt to provide one. It is rather an invitation to walk for a while alongside two extraordinary travelers, to reflect on the roads they chose and the conversations they encountered, and to ask whether Advaita and Zen were shaped not only in meditation halls and monasteries, but also on dusty roads, mountain passes, and distant shores. Like every worthwhile journey, This one begins not with certainty, it begins with a question. History often remembers great teachers for the ideas they leave behind. We speak of Plato and Aristotle, of the Buddha and Confucius, of Shankara and Bodhidharma, as though they arrived fully formed, carrying complete philosophies into the world. Reality is almost certainly more interesting. Ideas, like people, have histories. They mature, they encounter resistance, they absorb influences, they are tested in conversation long before they are written in books. If Professor Siddharthan's paper invited us to compare the philosophies of Advaita and Zen, perhaps the lives of their great exponents invite us to compare something more human, their journeys. Shankara's India was one of the most intellectually vibrant societies the world had known. Buddhism, Jainism, Mimamsa, Samkhya, Yoga, and the many streams of Vedic thought flourished simultaneously. Temples, monasteries, and royal courts were not merely places of worship or administration, they were centers of intellectual life. Into this world walked a young monk from Kerala. Tradition tells us that Shankara travelled the length and breadth of the Indian subcontinent on foot while still in his 30s. Every region brought a different language, a different deity, a different philosophical school. If one wished to understand India, one could scarcely remain in one place. Perhaps no encounter captures this better than Shankara's celebrated debate with Mandana Mishra. Mandana was no ordinary scholar, one of the foremost exponents of the Mimamsa tradition, which placed ritual, duty, and the authority of the Vedas at the center of spiritual life. The debate that followed entered Indian intellectual history, not because one philosopher defeated another, but for the seriousness with which truth was pursued. Presiding over the debate was Ubayabharati, Mandana's wife, and herself a philosopher of formidable learning, whose judgment was accepted by both participants. One imagines not a contest of egos, but a shared confidence that ideas matter. When the debate finally concluded, something remarkable happened. Mandana Mishra did not become Shankara's defeated opponent. He became Sureshwara, one of Advaita's greatest teachers. The conversation did not end in victory. It ended in synthesis. That perhaps tells us something profound about Shankara himself. His genius was not merely to argue. It was to integrate. The same instinct is visible in his efforts to harmonize India's great devotional traditions. Through the Shanmata system, the Panchayatana Puja, Shiva, Vishnu, Devi, Ganesha, and Surya were no longer rivals competing for supremacy, but different expressions of the same ultimate reality. Philosophy and ritual moved together toward an underlying unity. If Shankara's defining encounter unfolded through an extended dialogue, Bodhidharma's is astonishing for its brevity. Having journeyed from India into China, Bodhidharma eventually found himself standing before Emperor Wu of Liang, one of the greatest patrons Buddhism had known. The emperor had built temples, supported monks, and sponsored the copying of sacred scriptures, and understandably expected recognition for these acts of devotion. Instead, he encountered Bodhidharma. "I have built temples, ordained monks, and copied scriptures," the emperor declared. "What merit have I earned?" "None whatsoever." The emperor, bewildered, asked another question. "What is the highest meaning of the holy truth?" "Vast emptiness, nothing holy." Finally, the emperor asked, "Who stands before me?" "I do not know." The conversation was over almost as soon as it had begun. No elaborate argument, no careful commentary, only a few sentences that have echoed through the history of Zen for nearly 15 centuries. The contrast with Shankara could hardly be greater. One tradition delights in sustained philosophical dialogue. The other cuts through dialogue itself. One constructs, the other removes. One integrates complexity into an elegant whole. The other strips complexity away until only direct experience remains. Whether these encounters created their philosophies or merely revealed them, we cannot know. But one cannot help noticing that both occurred on the road, not in isolation, not in abstraction, but in living encounters with minds that challenge their own. Perhaps journeys transform us not because they show us new places. Perhaps they transform us because they place before us questions we could never have encountered had we remained at home. And perhaps, just perhaps, the roads travelled by Shankara and Bodhidharma became as important to the evolution of Advaita and Zen as the monasteries and scriptures that would later preserve their teachings. Having travelled for a while with Shankara and Bodhidharma, perhaps we should pause and ask a simple question. What exactly did these two remarkable travellers leave behind? The words Advaita and Zen have entered popular culture, invoked in books on leadership, mindfulness, psychology, even interior design. Yet, the philosophies themselves are often far richer and considerably subtler than their popular interpretations suggest. Professor Siddharthan's paper offers a wonderfully clear place to begin. He reminds us that both traditions are often described as non-dual. At first sight, that appears to mean they are saying the same thing. They are not, yet neither are they completely different. What they share is not a doctrine but an intuition. Both suggest that the ordinary human mind habitually divides the world into opposites: self and other, observer and observed, sacred and ordinary, success and failure, life and death. Much of our suffering, they suggest, arises from believing these divisions to be absolute. Interestingly, both traditions describe their deepest insight in negative rather than positive language. They do not speak primarily of oneness. They speak of non-duality. As Siddharthan points out, to describe ultimate reality simply as one immediately invites the possibility of two. Instead, both Shankara and the early Zen masters remove the distinction altogether. The deepest reality cannot easily be captured by categories through which the ordinary mind habitually thinks. Beyond this shared intuition, the two traditions begin to travel along different roads. For Shankara, beneath the astonishing diversity of the universe lies an underlying unity. The Upanishadic tradition, Tattvamasi, thou art that, becomes not merely a philosophical statement but an experiential possibility. The individual self is ultimately not separate from Brahman, the limitless reality underlying all existence. Multiplicity belongs to the world of appearance. Unity belongs to the deepest truth. One begins with diversity, one awakens with unity. Let me just repeat that for you to sit with it. Multiplicity belongs to the world of appearance. Unity belongs to the deepest truth. One begins with diversity, one awakens to unity. Zen approaches the same landscape from a very different direction. Rather than asking what is ultimately real, Zen asks a more immediate question. What is your experience before you begin thinking about it? A special transmission outside the scriptures, no dependence on words and letters, directly pointing to the human mind, seeing one's true nature. Zen therefore becomes deeply suspicious of concepts. not because concepts are wrong, but because they can quietly become substitutes for experience itself. Perhaps nowhere is this expressed more beautifully than in Siddhartha's comparison of samsara and nirvana. For Advaita, the changing world ultimately points beyond itself towards the unchanging reality of Brahman. For Zen, to separate samsara from nirvana is already to create a division where none exists. There is no reality waiting somewhere beyond the ordinary world. Reality is encountered precisely here. In this breath, this conversation, this cup of tea, this moment. The distinction is subtle. Advaita asks us to see through diversity towards unity. Zen asks us to see so completely that the distinction between diversity and unity quietly falls away. Yet, there is another difference that fascinated Professor Siddharthan. Every philosophy eventually produces an ideal human being. For Advaita, that figure is the Jivan Mukta, the liberated person who has realized the identity of Atman and Brahman, abiding in a profound inner peace. For Mahayana Buddhism and later Zen, the ideal becomes the Bodhisattva, one who refuses liberation for oneself alone, choosing instead to remain deeply engaged with the suffering of others until all beings are free. One embodies liberation, the other embodies compassion. One turns inward towards realization, the other returns outward towards service. Professor Siddharthan goes on to ask whether these differing ideals may have shaped the societies in which they evolved. An intriguing suggestion, though he is careful to remind us that ideas and societies almost certainly influence one another in both directions. For me, however, another question quietly emerged. Could these different ways of seeing have been shaped, at least in part, by the very journeys undertaken by Shankara and Bodhidharma themselves? Shankara spent years walking through one of the most philosophically diverse landscapes in human history, gradually seeking the unity that lay beneath apparent difference. Bodhidharma journeyed into an unfamiliar civilization where language, culture, and certainty themselves became unstable, eventually pointing not toward a grand philosophical system, but towards direct experience stripped of conceptual elaboration. We cannot know. History rarely grants us such certainty. Yet, the question itself is fascinating. And perhaps, before attempting an answer, it's worth asking what modern neuroscience might contribute to this conversation. For if journeys shape philosophies, they must first shape minds. At this point, it's worth pausing to acknowledge something important. Nothing that follows is an attempt to explain Advaita or Zen through neuroscience. Neither Shankara nor Bodhidharma possessed functional MRI scanners. Neither spoke of neural networks, predictive processing, or autonomic regulation. Their languages were those of philosophy, contemplation, and lived experience. Yet, modern neuroscience allows us to ask a different kind of question. Not whether these traditions are scientifically true, but whether they may have engaged aspects of the human brain in remarkably similar ways. That, I think, is a far more interesting conversation. One striking observation from contemporary neuroscience is that the brain is not a passive recorder of reality. It is an active predictor. Every moment, it anticipates what it expects to see, hear, and experience, constantly updating those expectations as new information arrives. Much of what we experience as certainty is in fact the brain's best prediction of the world around it. Travel has an interesting effect upon such a brain. Every unfamiliar landscape, every new language, every unexpected custom quietly challenges prediction. Assumptions that once seemed obvious become provisional. The brain is repeatedly invited to adapt. Psychologists speak of cognitive flexibility. Neuroscientists speak of neuroplasticity and adaptive learning. The traveler simply experiences wonder or discomfort or both. One wonders whether this prolonged engagement with novelty formed part of the intellectual environment within which both Shankara and Bodhidharma matured. Shankara's journeys exposed him to an astonishing diversity of philosophical systems, ritual traditions, and ways of understanding the sacred. It is tempting to imagine that such encounters gradually encouraged an increasingly integrative way of thinking, not by erasing difference, but by searching for what might underlie it at all. His later vision reflects the same instinct. The Shanmata tradition does not abolish devotion to Shiva, Vishnu, Devi, Ganesha, Surya, or Skanda. It places them within the larger whole. The Panchayatana Puja does not deny plurality, it organizes plurality. Even ritual itself begins to look rather different through this lens. A devotee moves attentively from one deity to another. Bells ring, incense rises, mantras are repeated. Attention is repeatedly gathered and redirected until finally the many forms dissolve into the formless Brahman. Was Shankara thinking about attention networks or sensory integration? Almost certainly not. But one cannot help noticing how naturally such contemplative practices engage precisely those capacities that modern neuroscience associates with sustained attention, emotional regulation, and the gradual quietening of habitual mental activity. Zen, however, travels a different road. If Advaita gently integrates complexity, Zen repeatedly removes it. Bodhidharma arrives in China with almost startling simplicity. No elaborate rituals, no intricate metaphysics, no accumulation of concepts. Sit, observe, see. The famous image of Bodhidharma sitting silently before a wall for 9 years has become one of the defining symbols of Zen. Whether every detail is historically accurate is almost beside the point. The image itself is psychologically powerful. Imagine what such sustained simplicity asks of the human mind. No novelty, no distraction, no intellectual performance. Eventually, the only thing left to observe is the observing mind itself. Again, neuroscience cannot tell us whether this leads to enlightenment, nor should it attempt to. But it can observe that sustained contemplative attention appears to influence the very systems involved in attention, emotional regulation, self-referential thinking, and autonomic balance. Contemporary studies of meditation, chanting, and contemplative practice increasingly suggest that these ancient disciplines may cultivate measurable changes in the way the brain and body regulate themselves. What fascinates me, however, is not the science, it is the convergence. Here are two traditions separated by geography, language, and philosophy. One develops through debate, synthesis, and symbolic richness. The other through simplicity, direct experience, and silence. Yet, both appear to cultivate remarkably similar human capacities. A quieter mind, a steadier attention, greater freedom from habitual reactivity, an increased ability to experience life without becoming overwhelmed by it. Perhaps this is where our exploration quietly returns to Professor Siddharthan's original question. He compared the philosophies of Advaita and Zen. Neuroscience allows us to ask another. Might different contemplative traditions sometimes arrive at similar forms of human flourishing through very different educational pathways? Let me ask that again so you sit with it. Might different contemplative traditions sometimes arrive at similar forms of human flourishing through very different educational pathways? I suspect we are only beginning to understand that possibility. And perhaps that is precisely why conversations between ancient wisdom and modern neuroscience have become so fascinating. Not because one validates the other, but because each invites us to see the other with fresh eyes. As our journey unfolded, I found myself wondering whether Shankara and Bodhidharma were unique or whether they belonged to a much older human tradition, full of teachers who seemed to have discovered something profound only after leaving the familiar behind. The Buddha leaves the security of Kapilavatsu and spends years walking through the Gangetic plains before awakening beneath the Bodhi tree. Mahavira wanders as an ascetic, embracing uncertainty and hardship. Guru Nanak undertakes his great udasis, traveling across the Indian subcontinent and beyond, engaging saints, scholars, and ordinary people in conversation. Xuanzang journeys in the opposite direction, leaving China in search of Buddhist wisdom of India, returning with scriptures that would reshape East Asian Buddhism. Swami Vivekananda walks across India before carrying Vedanta to the Parliament of Religions in Chicago, often remarking that India herself had become his teacher. Then there is Ramana Maharshi. His outward journey is perhaps the shortest of them all. As a young boy, he leaves Madurai for Arunachala, never to return in any meaningful sense. Yet that single journey becomes the beginning of one of the deepest inward pilgrimages in modern spiritual history. If Shankara and Bodhidharma remind us that some journeys unfold across continents, Ramana reminds us that a single destination can become an entire universe. And if you're interested in these gurus and their journeys, please do listen to the various podcasts in the Neurokrish Immersion and to the Spiritual Brain Masterclass, which also exists as part of the Neurokrish Immersion series. Their roads were different, their destinations were different, their philosophies were different, yet one cannot help noticing a recurring rhythm. The journey comes first, the teaching comes later. I do not mean to suggest that travel itself produces wisdom. Millions travel without becoming philosophers, just as many great thinkers have lived lives of remarkable geographical stillness. What seems to matter is something subtler. Travel unsettles certainty. It introduces unfamiliar landscapes, unfamiliar languages, and unfamiliar people. It forces us to encounter ideas that cannot easily be accommodated within our existing understanding of the world. Perhaps that is why journeys have occupied such an enduring place in humanity's spiritual imagination. The Jewish tradition remembers the Exodus. Christianity preserves the missionary journeys of Paul. Islam is shaped profoundly by the Hijrah from Mecca to Medina and by the continuing pilgrimage to Mecca. Buddhism begins with the Buddha's renunciation and years of wandering. The Upanishads themselves are filled with seekers moving from one teacher to another. Movement becomes a metaphor for transformation. The outer road mirrors the inner one. Against this larger canvas, the journeys of Shankara and Bodhidharma appear in a new light. They were not merely missionaries carrying finished philosophies from one place to another. They were seekers moving through worlds of extraordinary diversity. Shankara encountered a civilization alive with competing philosophical schools and ritual practices. His response was neither rejection nor uniformity, but synthesis. He searched patiently for the unity that could embrace diversity without destroying it. Bodhidharma journeyed beyond India into an unfamiliar civilization where Buddhism itself was evolving in conversation with Chinese thought. His response was almost the mirror image. Rather than adding another layer of interpretation, he stripped experience back to its essentials. One integrated, the other simplified. One built a bridge across difference, the other quietly removed the bridge altogether. Perhaps these were not simply two philosophies. Perhaps they were two responses to two very different journeys. We cannot know with certainty. History rarely offers certainty to those willing to ask interesting questions. Yet, there is something quietly persuasive about the possibility that before Advaita and Zen became enduring traditions, they were lived experiences. And that perhaps prepares us for our final reflection. If journeys can shape philosophies, might they also shape every one of us in ways both large and small? When I first opened Professor Siddharthan's paper, I imagined I was about to compare two great philosophies. In many ways, I did. His essay illuminates with remarkable clarity both the common ground and the profound differences between Advaita Vedanta and Zen Buddhism. He shows us how two traditions that both speak of non-duality eventually travel along very different philosophical paths. One culminates in Jivan Mukta, liberated through the realization of Brahman. The other gives us the Bodhisattva who remains in the world, moved by compassion for all human beings. It's a thoughtful and elegant comparison. Yet, somewhere along the way, another conversation quietly began. The question shifted from what did Shankara and Bodhidharma teach to how did they come to teach it. That perhaps is the privilege of scholarship. One thoughtful question gives rise to another. Ideas themselves undertake journeys. They leave one mind, find another, gather new companions along the road, and gradually evolve into something neither traveler could have anticipated. Perhaps philosophies evolve in much the same way. They are rarely born in isolation. They emerge from conversations, disagreements, unexpected encounters, unfamiliar landscapes, and long periods of reflection. The monastery matters, the scripture matters, the teacher matters, but perhaps the road matters too. We cannot know whether Shankara's long walks across the philosophical landscape of India deepened his search for the unity beneath its diversity. We cannot know whether Bodhidharma's passage into an unfamiliar China reinforced his insistence upon direct experience over conceptual elaboration. History is seldom generous enough to answer questions of that kind, but neither does it forbid us from asking them. Modern neuroscience has in its own language begun to remind us that minds are shaped by experience. Novelty, uncertainty, dialogue, solitude, and sustained contemplative practice all leave their mark upon the brain. Ancient contemplative traditions remind us that the disciplined cultivation of attention, awareness, and compassion can gradually transform the way we inhabit the world. Neither tradition requires the other, yet together they invite a conversation that is richer than either alone. And that is perhaps the enduring lesson of Advaita and Zen. Not that one is right and the other mistaken, not even that they are saying the same thing. Rather, that different civilizations, separated by geography and culture, found remarkably different pathways toward many of the same human aspirations. Clarity amidst confusion, steadiness amidst uncertainty, freedom from habitual reactivity, and a deeper understanding of what it means to be fully alive. Shankara walked across India, Bodhidharma crossed mountains and seas into China. One journey unfolded through synthesis, the other through simplicity. One built an elegant philosophical architecture capable of embracing diversity within unity. The other gently dismantled every conceptual scaffold until only direct experience remained. Different roads, different pedagogies, different civilizations, yet both continue to invite us to undertake journeys of our own. Perhaps that is why their stories will resonate after more than 1,000 years. Not because we are all called to become monks, not because we must cross continents in search of enlightenment, but because every human life eventually presents its own journeys. Some lead us across countries, others across careers, some through illness, others through love, grief, leadership, parenthood, or aging. Each asks something of us. Each quietly changes the traveler. And perhaps when we look back many years later, we discover that the places we thought we were traveling towards were never the deepest destination. The deepest journey was the transformation of the mind that traveled there. Thank you, Professor Siddharthan, for beginning a conversation that traveled further than either of us could have anticipated. And perhaps that is how the best ideas always evolve. They begin as someone else's question, they become our own journey, and somewhere along the road, they quietly transform us. If you like what we do here at the Neurokrish Immersion, please subscribe and share. We are on Apple, YouTube, and Spotify. Thank you so much for being here with us.